Let's go to the actual discussion about some of the content of the Book of Mormon now. There are all sorts of things we can talk about. A lot of people like to make issue of the fact that so many of the names, the city and location names in we'll call it the geography of the Book of Mormon, resemble actual geographical cities and bodies and mountains and hills in Joseph's surrounding area. So there's the geographical formations, there's the location names, there's the hill Cumorah itself, which clearly is probably going to tie to the hill that Joseph referred to near his home. And of course, we have the church coming out with a recent statement on the hill Cumorah just this February 2019. Let's talk about geographical locations, city names, and the hill Cumorah, and then we'll get to other matters of content. Right. What do you want to say about that?
Well, the geography is one of the things that got me onto the Indian designation. It was debates I was having with apologists over geography. And I knew this limited geography theory was a farce as soon as I heard it, because it just does not fit, and that they're trying like crazy to twist and distort the Book of Mormon itself, as well as the geography in Central America. In the Mound Builder myth, some versions have the Indians, or what became the Indians, the Mound Builders, they landed in South America, built mighty civilizations in Peru, traveled up through the Panama, the neck of land, and up to Mexico, built those mighty civilizations around the Central America, traveled up to the Mississippi River Basin, built all these mounds, and then finally into the Great Lakes region, where these tremendous battles took place, and they were destroyed and buried in the mounds. So they were civilized when they landed, and they started deteriorating as a civilization as time went on, as they traveled up, which made them ripe for destruction. So the Book of Mormon is very clear about the neck of land. And there's a passage, the main passage is in Alma 22:32, which describes the land southward and the land northward, connected by a narrow neck of land. And it says that the land southward was nearly surrounded by water, there being a neck of land between the land northward and the land southward. Meaning it was all surrounded by water except for where the neck of land is connected to it, going in, that leads into the land northward. Part of the land northward is the neck, and the narrow pass is the smallest part, which is at Panama, or what they called in Just Miss Day, the Isthmus of Darien, about 62 miles apart. Whereas the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in southern Mexico is about 120 miles. And various apologists have tried to narrow it or say that some guy can run across it really fast, and that is the distance of a day and a half for a Nephite on the line. So that's what the Alma passage also says, that it was a distance of a day and a half's journey for a Nephite on the line between desolation and bountiful, which is the land northward, land southward. So you can imagine, the Isthmus of Panama or this Isthmus of Darien. Right, South America goes across, is east to west. And anyone on the land, down on the ground, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is nothing. It doesn't narrow. You can't tell it narrows. It's 120 miles from sea to sea. So, but if you're on Darien, so the Central America goes east to west and then turns downward and connects into South America. Right where it connects, 62 miles across, and you can draw a line east to the west, because it says that in Alma 50:34, it says that they went through the narrow pass which led into the land northward by the sea on the east and the west. So when you're going through this passage, the sea is on the east and the west, and it's only a distance of a day and a half's journey for a Nephite, which fits perfectly. It does not fit the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, no matter what the apologist said. When I was young and I was researching this, their arguments just, in my mind, totally failed. They were trying way too hard to make it fit. They still are. It's totally a bogus argument. The distances being traveled are too great and that's why the Book of Mormon's a farce in a way, because traveling from the narrow neck up to the land of many waters, which would be the Great Lakes region, where the hill Cumorah is. The only hill Cumorah Joseph Smith knew about was the one in his backyard, practically. So there is no other hill Cumorah. They've invented another hill Cumorah to make their geography fit, and it's one thing after another to try to make it fit.
Was there any doubt during Joseph Smith's day whether Joseph Smith thought there were multiple hill Cumorahs and where Joseph Smith thought the hill Cumorah was?
No, he believed it was in New York. All of his followers believed it was in New York.
Not just in New York, but like right outside his house, right?
Yeah, right. That's the whole purpose. That the last battle, Oliver Cowdery is writing his history with Joseph Smith's help. And part of the history talks about the big battle that took place right there in New York between the Jaredites ended. This is another farcical thing about the Book of Mormon, is that the Jaredites' civilization ended at the same hill as the Nephites met their demise. So, and the Mound Builder myth located the last battles in New York.
Right.
Somewhere.
Right.
So it's in Joseph Smith's backyard. I mean, the imagination. He was a kid. So, there were mounds in a 10-mile radius of his house. There's, several mounds. There's like maybe 5-6 mounds, and one in Canandaigua, and some others that are even closer than that I can't remember the cities, but they're all around these fortification mounds where there's ridges of earth with picket works that the Book of Mormon describes. This is what they imagined some of these ridges of earth were topped with pickets. They even claim to have dug down and found the rotting wood. And it's true. The Indians, even during Joseph Smith's lifetime, were building these ridges of earth with picket works. And the one in Canandaigua, I think it was burnt by Captain Sullivan. There is a Captain Sullivan. There is even a historical site there even now. And so it was the historic Indians still building these fortification mounds. but that's what Joseph Smith, the odd thing is that Joseph Smith describes the fortification mounds in vast detail, but he doesn't describe the mighty temples in the same kind of detail as these fortification mounds, because they're like further away, down in Central and South America. So the limited geography was invented really when in 1887, and Orson Pratt was publishing a new edition of the Book of Mormon with footnotes giving all these traditional geography locations for the Hill Cumorah and other sites. The Reverend M.T. Lamb wrote a book called The Golden Bible, and where he talks about the Book of Mormon, and he makes fun of this traditional geography about the distances being traveled and the population. What it requires a massive or a very rapid population growth. He was making fun of that and some other things in the Book of Mormon as being, ridiculous history. When the Mormon apologists started looking for a smaller geographic area, and they debated between various places along Central America and some in South America, with larger ocean encroaching on the land, and they finally settled on the Isthmus of Tehuantepec for want of a better place. Even Blake Ostler, the one of the leading apologists, I would say, suggested in Sunstone magazines many years ago now that it was actually an island. It's not anywhere on the mainland. It has to be an island somewhere that's we can't locate. That's how desperate it's gotten. This is what I call desperate apologetics.
And my experience is it actually ends up deteriorating faith in the long run, because people initially feel encouraged and hopeful that the apologists are providing credible answers to the problems that the truth claims. But then the answers are so bad, like, when he said horses, he meant tapers, or, there really wasn't one Hill Cumorah, there was two, and it's in Central America. Once you do a little bit more digging, you realize that's preposterous. And then all of a sudden it even reinforces more the fact that the church is lying and deceiving people, versus just doing the move that John Hamer and others do, which is to say, all right, the Book of Mormon isn't historical, but it can still be inspired religious text or myth. Even David Bokovoy has this feeling that the book can have value and have mythical or even moral value or even spiritual value and still be a 19th century text, which many say it clearly is, right?
Clearly. You don't really understand the message of the book if you try to take it out of the 19th century context. But I would say the apologists are gaslighting, which is nothing is as it appears. They have to reinterpret everything to make it look feasible or plausible. They have to reinterpret everything. And so nothing is as it appears. And you need the apologists lengthy reinterpretations to make it fit the modern world. Same thing a lot of Christians do to the Bible. But
and so many of these explanations defy what Joseph Smith himself and every prophet from Joseph Smith to, let's just say, Spencer W. Kimball taught and believed. And so to believe the apologists, you have to rank their explanations as superior to 100 and whatever 80 years of prophets, seers, and revelators. And Joseph Smith himself, who was the very author of the book and the man who claimed to be speaking with Moroni and whoever, or Nephi, or whoever else he was speaking with, correct?
Well, I feel that you have to pay attention to what the first readers of the Book of Mormon interpreted. That it was written to them. And Nephi even says he delights in writing in plainness, that and prophesying in plainness. So then when Nephi describes the latter days, and he describes people that shall believe that they should be beaten with a few stripes and then enter into heaven, or people who deny that there's a hell. And the first readers of the book interpreted that as a reference to universalists. Then you got to pay attention to that, because it was written to them in plainness, and they're interpreting it. When they interpret the secret combinations as a reference to in ancient times with the Nephites, and that the secret combinations were responsible for the downfall of two civilizations, that they were Mason-like organizations. They weren't Masons, they were Mason-like organizations. But the book predicts that it will come forth at a time when there shall be secret combinations and secret murders. And the readers connect that with Masonry. Then you have to listen. You have to pay attention. You can't just like go, oh, that's meaningless.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, this is super interesting. So what do you make? A friend of mine, a close family member of mine, reached out to me lately and just said, we need to do a word print analysis of the probability of so many local city names and lake names and geographical names appearing, or Bible names appearing as either character names or city names or regional names in the Book of Mormon. The idea is that Joseph just clearly was pulling local cities and towns and bodies of water and mountain ranges, or from names he was familiar with in the Bible, and filling those in to all the character and geographical names that he finds in the Book of Mormon. And I think the CES letter also references a map or a comparison of city names and location names, ancient or New York local, to the Book of Mormon, to show all these comparisons. What do you make of that comparison? Is it credible? Is it significant? Is it a significant dent in the truth claims argument that Joseph Smith comes up with these names that conveniently are all around him?
Yeah, well, he's inventing names. He has to be inspired by something. The only thing I would resist would be the critics that try to say that these geographic names represent the Book of Mormon's geography. It's sort of like a critic's version of the limited geography. That I can't really follow. But as inspirations, who knows where the inspirations come from? You have to be really careful with names, because it becomes a name game. I mean, just like the 19th century researchers trying to find Hebrew words, they find Hebrew words scattered, but there's no context for it. They're free-floating words, and the words don't necessarily mean the same thing. And so you can do that. You can take names and find parallels to any language, really. And some scholars have cautioned against finding names. The apologists will find names, Hebrew names, and they make a lot out of that. And the critics find names, and they make a lot out of that. So that we have this like dueling name search going on. So no one could say for sure. All you can say is, because there's no context for the names. all you can say is that they're possible, and Joseph Smith is making up names. It's not impossible for him to make these names up. I like Ed Ashman's piece in Brent's book, New Approaches to the Book of Mormon. He divides them up into families of names where there's like Nephi, Ha, Moroni, Ha, so that it could go Moroni, Ha, so he's riffing off one set of invented names. There's there's Moroni, which isn't in the Book of Mormon, but it's another name he invented. So he keeps on inventing names. He invents Egyptian names profusely, and invents Egyptian names we know aren't Egyptian. So he can invent names. He's good at it, and he knows he's good at it. It's part of what he does.
Okay, so the fact that, and I just grabbed off of Google Images one of many graphics that you could find, and this is the Vernal Hawley sort of comparison. Yeah. There's Alma. There's an actual place named Alma somewhere near Joseph. There's an Antrim, which is like Antum. There's a Boaz in both places.
Lehi.
Connor versus Comner. There's Ephraim, Saint Ephraim versus Ephraim Hill. Helam versus Helam. Jerusalem, Jordan in both. There's a Kish Kimenedas, which is similar to Kish Kumen. There's a Lehi near Joseph. There's a Mantua, which is close to Manti. There's a Monroe. There's a Minoah versus a Minon. Even a Morin versus Moron. There are Noah Lakes instead of the land of Noah. There's an Oneida nearby, and there's also a Oneida in the Book of Mormon.
Indian tribe.
Omer versus Omner. Rama, there's a Rama with no H versus the Rama with an H. Sodom versus Sidom. Shiloh versus Shilom. Lake of Midian versus the land of Midian. You're saying that, okay, maybe there's something to that, but it could also just be confirmation bias where you're just looking for anything to confirm a conclusion. You don't lean one way or another in that.
They're not good. Names are not very good evidence.
In your opinion?
In my opinion, because he's pulling them out of the air. He's influenced by the Bible. That's kind of obvious, I think. Where some of the other names came from, it's hard to know. Like I said, he makes up names, and he did it with the Egyptian materials, and we know in the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, and we know those aren't Egyptian; that they're made up. So, and they look like what you would think they should look like if you were making up Egyptian names, in that time period. He does this stuff very well. So I don't know where, it's hard to say where these came from, but it could. Who knows where these influences are coming from?
Right. One of our listeners, Fred, he writes, growing up in upstate New York, I assumed all the names around me that matched so many things in the Book of Mormon were because they had named them after the Book of Mormon. It wasn't until I was older that I found they had their names first. They had their names first prior to the Book of Mormon being published. And that for him, that was a major shelf item. So that's Fred's own experience growing up in upstate New York. I guess that's reasonable, right?
It could be, these could be influences.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of people, I just want to say, Dan, just stepping aside from the substance, so many people really appreciate you particularly because even though, you don't hide your feelings that this book was written by Joseph Smith, you're not eager to grasp at any attack as valid, and you're willing to suspend judgment or even denounce an attack, much like Gerald Tanner was about Mark Hoffman.
Right.
If you don't think it's a credible attack. Dave Wilson writes, I admire Dan's.
Right.
What's that?
I'm not necessarily right.
Right.
But
you're trying hard to be fair, is all I'm saying.
I'm trying to be fair, but you want more of a context. 'Cause the reason why I'm so hesitant is that, so what do you do with a situation like Nahom, and they have a name, and that's all they have really, and in a general geographic area, and that's it. So, and then they run with it, and there's nothing more to substantiate it, the Nahom connection.
Right.
So what do you do with that? And what do you do with? So I would ask the apologists, well, what do you do with the Cumorah Islands of Moroni? These are all situations that could be explained by coincidence.
Right. Exactly.
So,
okay.
If that's all you have is the coincidence of names, and they're all over the place, names all over how many names of cities were there in Joseph Smith's day is incalculable. So
right. Okay. So let's address the Nahom apologetic. Yeah. You've referenced it, but I just want to give listeners a little bit more detail about it, and then your response to it. Tell us about the apologetic origins of the Nahom defense, and then give your best apologetic version of why they think Nahom proves the Book of Mormon's a historical document, and then give your quick response to that, if that's okay.
No, okay. So Nahom is, they tout this widely as archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. It's some spot in the Arabian desert. Now Lehi leaves Jerusalem and travels eastward, and then travels nearly southward down the Arabian Peninsula, and then makes a turn and travels nearly eastward to a place they called Bountiful, and then they build a ship and take off. So the apologists found that there was a Nahom, Nhm, because Hebrew and Arabic do not have these vowels, or the ancient consonants didn't have vowel marks necessarily. The vowel marks come later, but so they say it's Nahom, the Book of Mormon, and in the Book of Mormon, you read this story of Lehi's travel, and when they get to the bottom and make their turn to go eastward to the sea, this is where Ishmael dies, and they bury him, and then it says, in a place that was called Nahom, and every time before that, it always says, "We called this place," and they're making up names of places as they go. So the apologists try to make a lot out of the wording of it was called. It could be it was called by who? It was called by somebody. It doesn't say who. It could be called by us. It could be called by the Nahomites. The Book of Mormon doesn't mention any people, but they found an altar that has the NHM on it. And there's various criticisms of this designation, like the H is a long H instead of a short H, or vice versa. I can't remember which right off. And it means slightly different. Okay, there's a prophet Nahom in the Old Testament, and his name means to mourn, And so if Joseph Smith picked Nahom right at this point where Ishmael had died, and then he says, I'm going to pick Nahom, this Hebrew word, or Nahum, so that the vowels don't matter really. Nahum, and it means to mourn, and the people are mourning over Ishmael's death. So this is a coincidence. Coincidences happen. Whenever you have a large body set, and we were talking about 144 names in the Book of Mormon, and you're in a part of the world where there are existing names. There aren't any in the New World to try to latch Book of Mormon names to, really. But in the Old World, so you have Nahom, NHM, they make a big thing out of that. So, like I said, when you study large data sets, you're going to find coincidences that are usually described as uncanny coincidences, meaning, wow, how do you explain that coincidence? Well, another one I try to point to is the Moroni in the Cumorah Islands, and that I believe also is a coincidence because.
So this is the Captain Kidd book. This is we know that there were these legends of buried treasure. We know that Joseph Smith was a fan of the Captain Kidd book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that Joseph Smith was into treasure digging.
Well, the Captain Kidd book, sorry. There's a claim in 1885 by Anna Ruth Eaton, a resident of Palmyra, whose husband was a minister there, who said that there's stories of Joseph Smith reading Captain Kidd's book. So there could be Captain Kidd. I mean, it would be a popular book for kids to read, but nobody knows if Joseph Smith really read it. I mean, that's not a very solid evidence of it. But the important thing is that, okay, it's fairly well known that Captain Kidd went to the Cumorah Islands, but it's not a major part of the story of Captain Kidd. It's a very minor part.
But there's a map in the book that's got a Cumorah and a Moroni on the map, right? Or something like Cumorah, right?
I don't know. I didn't ever hear that the map was in the book. But if you look on a map from before the Book of Mormon,
okay,
and you go to the Cumorah Islands, and there's several. Moroni is not the capital of Cumorah, the Cumorah Island. Later, it became the capital, I believe. But at the time of Joseph Smith, it was just a minor name among many names along the coast. Why Joseph Smith would look and latch onto that name, I don't, it doesn't make any sense. So,
and I'm looking at it, a Fair Mormon response to this argument, and it shows a Comoros, Comors island with a city Moroni. So I just want to make sure we're using the right language. It's a Grand Comore, Comore, or Comoros, Comoros, with a Moroni as a city, right?
Right. So it's obscure. It's not part of the main. If it were the main part of the story, you would have a really good case. Like if you had a book that, and this has not been found, this is like Joseph Smith. If only we had a book, right? That's what Joseph Smith thought. If only we had a book that you opened up, it told the Captain Kidd story and that he buried treasure on Cumorah Island, and Cumorah Island was his main place, and he hung out at Moroni in one book. That would be, wow. And maybe a book like that exists that we haven't found, but so far we haven't found it. That's what I would like to see before I said, for now I'm thinking it could be very well just a coincidence, one of those uncanny coincidences. It's hard to say that it's a coincidence. I mean, because of the similarities of the names. But we might be doing to ourselves what, you've heard of the term pareidolia, which is when you look at ink blots or clouds and you see shapes of familiar things. The human brain does that. Well, this would be one of hearing, this would be an example of hearing, pareidolia. But so I'm hesitant to make the conclusion. I don't think we should be giving ourselves high fives or anything for discovering this coincidence.
Okay.
But,
and I just shared 3 articles, one from Wheat and Tares, one from
Grant Palmer, maybe.
What's that?
Oh,
there's a Grant Palmer article. There's a Grant Palmer article that I shared from the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal that you can reference. There's a Wheat and Tares blog article, and there's a dialogue article by Noel Carmack. Those are just 3 examples of different attempts to make these ties, and it's good to have your perspective on that, Dan.
But for now, it stands as a challenge to the Nahom designation, which is less striking, really, compared to this coincidence. This coincidence over here and their coincidence over there. If they had more, like they dug there and they found some record of Lehi or something, or if the Book of Mormon mentioned that they met people there, that might be a little more that'd be something. As it is, the Book of Mormon does not mention meeting anybody, and it sounds like they're trying to avoid everybody. And it's nimbly reconstructed the whole journey down the frankincense trail, that they tried to avoid that trail. The Book of Mormon says they followed the more fertile parts of the land, which was close to the water, whereas Nahom is up on the plateau. It's actually a whole region, not just a specific place, really. And it's not Nahom necessarily. It was also called Nim, Nihm, the Nimites. So, and they didn't have any one certain location, really. They were nomadic. And so it's a little, so you find this site where Nephi supposedly takes the name of the place that's already there. And but you can't find any Nephite cities once you get to all that, the New World. You can find one little thing out in the desert, but you can't find a whole civilization in the New World. Anyway, so that's the name game. That's how the name game can be played out and lead you off if you make too many bold conclusions about name coincidences. You can really get yourself into trouble.
Okay, so on the one hand, you don't see the Nahom defense as credible, but on the other hand, that means we have to be consistent and not make too much of the, for example, Moroni, Cumorahs Island Captain Kidd map either.
Right.
What do you make of the Jack Welch Chiasmus apologetic defense of the Book of Mormon, that Chiasmus is this ancient common Hebrew sort of form of writing? It appears in the Book of Mormon, therefore the Book of Mormon is an ancient document. What do you make of that?
Okay, when it first came out in BYU studies, about 1968 or 9, it was touted as proof that the Book of Mormon is Hebrew, along the same lines as Hebrew idioms that they find in the Book of Mormon, which is like, instead of saying plates of gold, instead of saying golden plates, or they say plates of gold, which is the way you would say it in Hebrew if you translated it literally. So Chiasmus was touted as a proof for Hebrew, But when it was also discovered in other ancient writings, any ancient writing, Greek, Latin, Arabic, I think even cuneiform, not sure, but then it became not a proof of Hebrew origin, it became proof of ancient origin. Then it was started to be discovered in the Doctrine and Covenants. A guy named Richard Shipp wrote a whole master's thesis on it, fascinating thesis. And he pulled out chiasms in the Doctrine and Covenants. And one of them I quoted in the last interview, which is in D&C 19, which I'll quote now. Behold, I, God, have suffered these things for all if they would repent. But if they would not repent, they must suffer even as I, which is a chiasm. So, and we have chiasms in English, you know. That's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And they, you know, sound great. So what of this chiasms? And it was actually known in Joseph Smith's time. Quinn made a lot in his reprint of the Magic Book, early Mormon history in the Magic Worldview or something like that. Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. He found where they talked about chiasmus in Hebrew in the Old Testament during Joseph Smith's time. But I think a more likely source is rhetoric, how the ministers were taught rhetoric. There's actually, chiasms are only one part of the overall Book of Mormon style. And the style is to imitate the Old Testament. And the Old Testament uses a lot of parallelisms, you know, where it repeats the line, the word of the Lord shall come out of Zion and the law from Jerusalem. When Zion and Jerusalem are the same place. So it's kind of like a parallel, these parallelisms. And they're throughout, that's the form of Hebrew poetry. I mean, we like to rhyme. That's our one way of writing poetry anyway, rhyme. And there's different schemes for writing poetry and different rhyme schemes. But so in Hebrew, there was different parallelisms and different parallelism schemes. And it's generally under the title rhetorical repetition. So you use it to emphasize, even in English, in speeches like Martin Luther King and Bible-oriented preachers, especially Baptists, Methodists, in their emotional speeches, they like to use this rhetorical repetition. And the ministers learned it. And there's a whole bunch of different categories for repetition. There could be like anaphora is one. It's, you know, we teach Christ, we preach Christ, we believe in Christ, you know, the repetition at the end of the line or whatever. So epistrophe, and there's a whole bunch of these categories of rhetorical repetition. There's no mystery to Joseph Smith's time. And the chiasmus was called in Joseph Smith's day anti-metaboly. And you can look this up in rhetorical books of Joseph Smith's day. And they'll give you examples of anti-metaboly where they repeat one way and repeat it backwards. So that's generally what chiasmus is. It's not a big mystery of the Hebrew origin of the Book of Mormon. Another aspect of chiasmus is that when you look for chiasmus in the Book of Mormon, people that did this eventually started seeing chiasmus everywhere. You know, it's the guy with the hammer, everything looks like a nail thing. And they found chiasms into the thousands. And I have a book written by a Mormon apologist that at that one time there was chiasmus everywhere. And the problem is the ingenuity of the researcher sometimes invents chiasmus where none was intended. And intended is a very hard thing to prove, especially when the chiasmus gets so scattered and you start picking words here and there to make your parallels out of. You're only picking this word over here and that word and this word and this word, and you're making them. And with a little imagination, you can make one almost anywhere in the Book of Mormon. Well, Jack Welch didn't like that, so he invented some rules about what should be considered a real chiasmus and what should not. And the tighter the chiasmus, the easier it is to prove intentionality, the intentionality of the author. So he called things that interfered with the tightness of the chiasm as mavericks. So some chiasms would be, and there's also another rule that he made was imbalance. So on one side of the chiasmus would be like a few words, maybe a sentence, and on the other end of the chiasmus would be a whole paragraph. And this is how they manipulate the text to make a chiasm out of their imagination. Now, Jack Welch made these rules because there aren't any ancient rules that they found where the Hebrews said that this is how to do it, and this is how, this is a real one and a false one. This is Jack Welch trying to give integrity to his original theory and not have it all scattered out and it loses its effect. When you apply these rules, you only come out with a dozen or so chiasms in the whole Book of Mormon. And anyway, so when you examine some of these chiasms, let's say one of the big ones is always Alma 36, where Alma's being describing his conversion. For 3 days and 3 nights I was racked with the pains of a damned soul. Well, this is where he goes one way. It appears that he tells the story one way and then he reverses it and tells the damned part, and then where he was released from his torture and received a spiritual experience. And so if this is what is called a natural chiasm, which is when you're telling a story and then you reverse the story and you just go in reverse order, and it's a very natural thing. And it's very loose. Alma 36 is not all that tight. And even the guy that at BYU, I believe, or BYU Studies anyway, his last name's Edwards, and his son, I think it is, did a computer analysis and tried to find which ones were the most intentional by which ones had the fewest mavericks. And he even had to cut the Alma 36 down smaller because he didn't think some of the parts that Jack Welch mapped out were legitimate. They weren't tight enough. And so, and Welch has given several versions of it. But I believe, like I said, it's a natural chiasm that more or less works out. But to prove that, there was this, intention on every word and everything. And then with some of these chiasms, the questions arise as to the content of or which words. And so lately, apologists have wanted to argue that the translation is very loose. Even like Ostler, some of it's added. And whereas these chiasms, some of them would require a very literal translation taking place. So there becomes that conflict. So I don't think it is all that the evidence that apologists have made it out to be. It's possible that Joseph Smith wrote some of these sermons. These are mostly in sermon areas, the tighter ones. And he could have wrote sermons out, went out to the woods when he was praying during those other hours, or had some of his own sermons memorized. And that's how he retained some of this tightness of some of the chiasms.
And again, and this is just a simple other point to consider regarding chiasmus. Dr. Seuss books include chiasmus, but that doesn't prove that they're of ancient origin, right?
That's how I feel about it. Some of it's invented in the eye of the beholder. There's a lot of other structures, though. When you get outside of chiasmus, there's other rhetorical repetitions that are very interesting that Joseph Smith does. And all of this appears in his revelations. And some people try to argue that the chiasms in the book, Doctrine and Covenants aren't as good as the ones in the Book of Mormon, but that's really not a very relevant argument, since you're using chiasm to prove that it's ancient. If it appears in the Doctrine and Covenants but not as good, plus if somebody can go and make thousands of chiasms in the whole Book of Mormon, and you have like this little contest to see which ones are the best or the tightest, and you forget about all the rest, you don't see the ocean, and you're cherry picking the chiasms, the best ones, then what you're doing is committing the fallacy of favorable circumstances, meaning you're in a sea and it's a very favorable circumstance of repetitions of all different kinds occurring, and then you pick out the repetition of favorable circumstances, then you have to consider the odds are that some of them could be created by accident.
Okay. We have a couple important, good comments from listeners. Kristen Gluth Cranny. Hey, Kristen. She writes, Thomas Waymont, BYU professor that headed up the Joseph Smith translation project, basically said that Joseph Smith, quote, spoke King James Bible. Kristen writes, chiasmus was in the King James Bible. Therefore, if Joseph Smith were even to give a sermon, it would probably be spoken, at least in part, in chiasmus. So that's a good point.
Yeah, unintentionally.
Right.
He could be following an Isaiah pattern.
Right.
But true, I think that's what I say, he spoke fluent Bible. And when he wanted to.
So shout out to Kristen for that great comment.
Yeah,
Pat Flanagan writes,
very good comment.
Pat Flanagan writes, the word chiasmus sounds like a nerve that you only feel when rain is coming. I think he's trying to be cute.
Yeah.
No, but it speaks
it's good to have a sense of humor about this stuff.
What's that?
It's good to have a good sense of humor about this stuff.
But it does speak to just this, what appears to be kind of a desperate attempt by apologists to make the Book of Mormon work when it just doesn't work as a historical document. Let me ask you just really quickly, okay, Dave Wilson. No, I'll come back to Hebraisms in
One comment I want to make is,
oh, go ahead.
We should acknowledge that from the point of view of the true believer, they have evidence that they have a hard time explaining. And there's going to be those kinds of things, but it's where you want to put the what you consider to be the strongest evidence. To me, if you show anachronisms, in my mind, trump anything you think that supports the Book of Mormon, because anachronisms are used by scholars to date forged documents. That's how they do it. And to me, one negative, well-founded negative evidence overrides all this other stuff that you think is impossible for Joseph Smith to do. And that's a subjective judgment. The thing that Brian Hales is trying to do lately, and this is where I would go if I were a believer, would be to try to prove the Book of Mormon's an inspired revelation, not history, but inspired revelation. And this is, you would want to point out how difficult the task was. The only difference is that I use this evidence to tell me how good Joseph Smith really was, who he really was. So, and that's one thing about the Spalding theory, is that while Joseph Smith and other early Mormon apologists are trying to tout Joseph Smith as an ignorant, the unlearned who read the sealed book, right? Well, they're trying to push him as that unlearned person, trying to read the sealed book, that God will use the weak things to confound the mighty. That's the way they looked at it. That's the miracle. I look at it as this is a ruse, that it's not true. Joseph Smith is not that stupid. This is who he really is. This is his talent. This is what he gave, his talent he gave to God. This is his religious sacrifice, in a way. This, in a way, Joseph Smith used to like this metaphor. He was raising his hand to steady the Ark of Covenant, the Ark of the Covenant. He's steadying the Ark of the Covenant that he saw was weak, which was the Bible. And one time he said, only God and Joseph Smith can steady the Ark. So he is smart. This is who he is. And this is the talent that he gave. This is what he gave to the cause of God.